She was an anomaly from the moment she stepped in front of a camera. Born in 1976, she was an anomaly. Unlike the stars birthed in poverty-stricken housing estates, Gigi emerged from the quiet, leafy streets of the middle class. The Maryknoll Convent School taught mathematics, history, and the rigid etiquette of the upper crust. While other aspiring singers were dropping out of school to sing in smoky nightclubs, Gigi was walking the halls of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University studying design. This background was her armor. It gave her an aura of intellect that couldn't be faked. When the cameras flashed, she lacked the desperation of fame. Instead, she appeared to be doing the industry a favor simply by existing. She was tall, 5'9", slender, and possessed a face that was almost startling in its lack of aggression. But the masterstroke was the hair. In 1995, long cascading hair was the non-negotiable currency of femininity in Asia. It signaled submission, romance, tradition. Gigi cut hers off. It was a short, sharp crop that exposed her long neck and emphasized her large, expressive eyes. It should have been a risk. Instead, it became a cultural phenomenon. The release of her album Love Myself and the breakout hit Short Hair wasn't just a musical success, it was a rebranding of the ideal Hong Kong woman. The lyrics spoke of independence, of cutting off the past along with the hair, but the melody was sweet, unthreatening. Far from a rebel, she was the Jade Girl, Yuk Nui, for the new millennium. Jade is cold to the touch, hard to break, and flawless. That was the brand. She was the girlfriend you could bring home to your conservative mother. She was the student you wanted your daughter to emulate. In a sea of over-sexualized imagery, Gigi Leung was a glass of ice water. She starred in Full Throttle alongside Andy Lau, playing the gentle grounding force to his reckless racer. She was the anchor. By 1997, as the British flag was lowered and the Chinese flag was raised, Gigi Leung had become a commodity of immense value. Her image was everywhere, on billboards, on magazine covers, in television commercials selling everything from watches to beverages. She represented a stability that the city was losing. She was the cleanest thing in Hong Kong. But in the Hong Kong entertainment ecosystem, clean was not a state of being. It was a marketing strategy aimed at the powerful. By 1999, the industry had consolidated. The street-fighting triads who once wielded machetes had evolved into corporate entities, trading violence for fountain pens and boardroom influence. Figures like Albert Yeung were establishing a new feudal system where they didn't just sell records, they owned the artists. Gigi Leung, with her university degree and Jade Girl dignity, was an anomaly in this machine. She wasn't an emperor group creation like Joey Jung or Nicholas Tsay. She was an independent force floating in the upper atmosphere of fame without a corporate tether. To the tycoons dining in the private rooms of the Peak, her independence was an irritant. Her purity wasn't a virtue, it was a challenge. The wolves were circling, waiting to see if the porcelain would crack. The primary mechanism of control in this world was the dinner party. These weren't social gatherings. They were tributes held in the VIP rooms of exclusive karaoke clubs or on private yachts in Deepwater Bay. Attendance for starlets was mandatory, a terrifying ritual of giving face. Eventually, the invitation came for Gigi. It arrived as a polite request for a birthday celebration, but in the underworld's dialect, it was a summons. Refusal would be a declaration of war against the men who controlled the media, the radio stations, and the cinema chains. Gigi, perhaps believing her status would protect her, stepped into the lion's den. The night didn't begin with violence. It began with luxury, the hum of a sedan climbing the Peak, the glitter of city lights below, and the opening of a heavy soundproof door. When that door clicked shut, it sealed out the paparazzi, the fans, and the law. Inside, the atmosphere was clinical. The men in the room, investors and shadow figures, watched with the detached interest of biologists examining a specimen. They began with drinking games that served as tests of submission, tightening the tension like a piano wire. Then, the legend says, came the cake. In the dark lore of Hong Kong's urban legends, the specific confection varies, but its transformation is consistent. A piece of food was weaponized. The game shifted instantly from playful to predatory. The directive given to the Jade Girl stripped her of her education and talent, reducing her to a mere object of amusement. This moved beyond a sex scandal into the realm of body horror. The allegation is specific and terrifying. The cake was not eaten, but forcibly used to violate her. The psychological terror lay in the juxtaposition. The sweetness of a dessert turned into an instrument of torture, a message that the powerful could turn anything into a weapon and anyone into a vessel for their amusement. The aftermath described in the whispers of the underground forums was immediate and medical. A frantic covert evacuation took place, not to a public emergency room, which would generate police reports, but to St. Teresa's Hospital in Kowloon, an institution known for its discretion. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a private operating theater, a doctor was summoned for an extraction. The physical pain was likely blinding, but the psychological scar being carved was deeper. In that sterile recovery room, the Jade Girl effectively died. The cover-up machine went into overdrive immediately. Medical records were sealed, staff were silenced, and the official story of acute exhaustion was released to the press. Gigi was allegedly flown out of Hong Kong almost immediately. Some say she went to Taiwan, others say she vanished into Europe for weeks. The disappearance was explained away by her management as a spiritual retreat or preparation for a new album. Back in Hong Kong, the party continued. The men went home to their wives. The VIP room was cleaned by staff who knew better than to look at what they were mopping up. The traces of the cake were scrubbed from the carpet. The scent of cognac and fear was scrubbed clean. But secrets in Hong Kong have a half-life. They decay and leak. A nurse whispers to a cousin. A driver talks to a bodyguard. A waiter posts on a fledgling internet forum. The story of the cake began to seep into the groundwater of the city. It didn't appear in the newspapers, not yet. The media moguls protected their own. But on the streets, in the cha-chan-tangs, and in the makeup rooms of TVB, the story spread like a virus. They didn't speak it aloud. They used code. They made jokes. And Gigi Leung, lying in a hospital bed thousands of miles away, or perhaps hidden in a darkened apartment in mid-levels, had to face a terrifying realization. The physical wound would heal, the infection would be treated, but she now carried a stain that no amount of bleach could remove. She had been marked. She was the girl with the cake, and the city was waiting for her to return, not to comfort her, but to see if she would break when they laughed. The nightmare had ended, but the punishment was just beginning. The silence of the hospital room was replaced by the deafening roar of a public that sensed blood in the water. If the rumor of the cake incident was the bullet that pierced the armor of the Jade Girl, the scandal of late 1999 stripped that armor away, leaving her exposed before the firing squad. The public accepted a gruesome urban legend about sexual humiliation with such ease because the moral outrage had already been primed. The soil had been poisoned by a love story known as the Song Ki War. It was known as the Song Ki War, the the War of the Two Chis. Qi, or Chi, referred to the names of the two women involved, Maggie Xu, Xu Mei-qi, and Gigi Leung, Leung Wing-qi. And at the center of this hurricane stood Aiken Cheng, the man who was, at that moment, the coolest entity in the chaotic universe of Hong Kong entertainment. In the cultural consciousness of 1999, Aiken Cheng carried the weight of a god. He was Chan Ho-nam, the protagonist of the Young and Dangerous film series. He was the quintessential bad boy with a heart of gold, the triad leader who valued loyalty above all else. His long hair, his leather jackets, and his brooding silence made him the idol of every teenage boy and the fantasy of every woman. For 7 years, Aiken had been in a relationship with Maggie Xu. Maggie was older, a respected actress who had stood by him when he was a nobody. Their relationship was viewed as a sacred contract in the industry. Aiken had famously declared to the media, in a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability, that he would take care of Maggie for the rest of his life. In a city as transient and money-obsessed as Hong Kong, this promise was treated like a vow of knighthood. It was the promise of the century. Then came October 1999, the siege of Sai Kung. For days, reporters had been camping outside Aiken Cheng's villa in Sai Kung, acting on a tip-off. The atmosphere was electric. The paparazzi were not just observers. They were hunters, waiting for the kill. They knew someone was inside. They knew the promise of the century was about to be broken. On the morning of October 4th, the front door opened. Out walked Gigi Leung. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't wearing sunglasses to cover her face. She walked out with a smile that the press would later describe as the smile of the victor. It was a birthday celebration, Aiken's birthday. She had spent the night. The image of Gigi Leung walking out of that house was the visual equivalent of a bomb detonation. In that single frame, the Jade Girl was obliterated. The narrative shifted instantaneously. She was no longer the innocent student from Maryknoll. She was the Siu Sam, the third party, the homewrecker, the fox spirit who had seduced the loyal hero and destroyed the suffering older woman. The public reaction was visceral and terrifyingly misogynistic. In Chinese culture, the fox spirit is a demon that disguises itself as a beautiful woman to steal the life force and husbands of honest men. Gigi fit the profile perfectly in the eyes of the tabloids. She was younger, fresher, and she had stolen Aiken from Maggie, who was portrayed as sick, aging, and discarded. The hate that rained down on Gigi was disproportionate to the crime. Aiken, the man who actually broke the promise, was criticized, but he was eventually forgiven. He was a man, after all. Men wander. But Gigi was a woman who had transgressed the cardinal rule of the Jade Girl. She had shown agency. She had taken what she wanted. And for a woman in 1999 Hong Kong to be sexually aggressive enough to steal a man was unforgivable. This is where the cake incident rumor found its fertile ground. The two scandals, the love triangle and the tycoon's torture, became inextricably linked in the public imagination. The psychology of the mob is cruel but consistent. The public felt that Gigi had committed a moral crime by destroying Maggie Xu's happiness. Therefore, she deserved to be punished. When the rumors of the cake incident began to circulate on the nascent internet forums and in the whispers of the wet markets, they were not met with horror or sympathy. They were met with a grim karmic satisfaction. The narrative logic of the street went like this: you used your body to steal a man, then your body will be used by men to destroy you. There was a twisted symmetry that the public latched onto. The love scandal had started with a birthday cake, the one she celebrated with Ekin in Tycoon. The urban legend ended with a birthday cake, the one allegedly used to violate her in the tycoon's VIP room. The cake became a symbol of her hubris and her downfall. The first cake represented her victory as a seductress. The second cake represented her humiliation as a victim. The tabloids fed this beast with relentless efficiency. Next Magazine and Oriental Sunday ran cover stories that juxtaposed images of a weeping Maggie Shu with images of a triumphant Gigi, and then subtly hinted at the dark rumors of her hospitalization. They didn't print the cake incident as fact, libel laws prevented that, but they used innuendo. They used headlines that dripped with double meanings about eating and swallowing and consequences. Gigi tried to fight back. She held a press conference. She tried to explain that Ekin and Maggie had broken up months before she entered the picture. She tried to use logic, but you cannot use logic to fight a witch hunt. The public didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. They wanted to see the Jade Girl dirtied. The concerts she held during this period were excruciating. Standing on stage, singing songs about first love while the audience pictured her in a hospital bed, became an act of dissociation. The applause was thinner. The heckling began. Posters of her face in MTR stations were defaced, her eyes scratched out. The word Fox scrawled across her forehead in marker. Her career didn't end, but it mutated. The innocent roles dried up. The commercials for wholesome products were quietly canceled. She was still a star, but she was now a controversial star. She had entered the dark era of her career. The Sonky scandal stripped her of the one thing that might have protected her from the cake rumor: public sympathy. If she had still been the untouched saint, the idea of her being tortured by a tycoon might have sparked outrage. People might have risen up to defend her. But because she was viewed as a homewrecker, the public response to the cake incident was a collective shrug, or worse, a sneer. She played with fire, they said, and now she's getting burned. This was the double blow. The love triangle destroyed her moral standing, and the urban legend destroyed her physical dignity. She was trapped in a pincer movement of misogyny. On one side, she was the predator who stole a husband. On the other, she was the prey who was devoured by the wolves of the Emperor Group. By the end of 1999, the Gigi Leung, who had debuted with short hair, was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the absolute worst of human nature, both from the billionaires in the private rooms and the ordinary citizens on the street. She was isolated, battered by a storm of hate that seemed to have no end. The millennium was turning, and while the rest of the world was celebrating a new beginning, Gigi Leung was trying to figure out how to survive the wreckage of her own life. The Jade Girl was dead. The survivor was about to be born, but the labor pains would last for a decade. By the dawn of the new millennium, Hong Kong had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just the flags flying over Government House that were different. The very air had coarsened. If the tycoons were the architects of the city's power, the media had become its executioners. And in the year 2000, Gigi Leung found herself strapped to the electric chair, with a switch controlled by an industry that had abandoned journalism for blood sport. The torture Gigi endured after the cake incident was amplified by a specific weapon, the printing press. This was the era of Next Magazine, Yacht Doe, and Oriental Sunday. Under the direction of media moguls like Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong press had undergone a terrified, violent evolution. The gentlemanly rules of the 1980s where stars and reporters had a symbiotic, respectful relationship, were dead. In their place was a new doctrine: sensationalism is survival. The market was flooded. To sell magazines in a city obsessed with money and status, you didn't need truth. You needed gore. You needed to show the public that the gods they worshipped were actually dirty, broken, and human. The paparazzi were no longer photographers. They were puppy teams, gaojai tui. They were organized packs of hunters, equipped with telephoto lenses that looked like sniper rifles, driving modified vans that could outrun police cars. They didn't want a photo of Gigi smiling. They wanted a photo of her looking exhausted, angry, or ideally crying. For Gigi Leung, the cake incident became the ultimate ammunition for this machine. The genius of the Hong Kong tabloid press lay in its ability to destroy a reputation without ever printing a single legally actionable sentence. They couldn't write, Gigi Leung was sexually assaulted with a cake by a tycoon. That would invite a lawsuit from the Emperor Group that would bankrupt them, so they used the headline that kills without a knife. They weaponized innuendo. The covers of the weekly magazines during this period were masterpieces of cruelty. They would run a photo of Gigi, perhaps looking pale or thin from the stress, next to a photo of a dessert or a generic bakery item. The headlines were pun-filled nightmares. Gigi swallows the bitter pill. The sweetness turns sour. A heavy meal for the Jade Girl. To the uninitiated, these looked like standard gossip headlines. But to the Hong Kong public, who were already consuming the rumors on the internet forums, the code was clear. The magazines were winking at the reader. They were validating the urban legend. They were saying, we know what you know. It's true. Look at her face. Look at her shame. This was a specific form of psychological warfare. It forced Gigi to live in a state of constant low-grade paranoia. Every interview became a trap. Every question about her health, you look tired, Gigi. Are you eating enough? Felt like a veiled reference to the hospital, to the surgery, to the foreign object. The paparazzi didn't just document her fall. They actively tried to provoke it. They camped outside her apartment building in mid-levels for weeks. They chased her car. They shouted questions at her that were designed to trigger a breakdown. How is your stomach, Gigi? Do you still like cake? Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required to walk out of your front door every morning, knowing that 50 men are waiting to take a photo of your humiliation. And this wasn't celebrity, this was hunting. The camera lens is an aggressive object. When 50 of them are pointed at you, accompanied by blinding flashes, it feels like a physical assault. It strips you of your skin. And the cruelest part was the audience participation. The Hong Kong public bought these magazines by the millions. They were sold at every 7-Eleven, every newsstand, every MTR station. You couldn't walk down the street without seeing Gigi's face plastered on a cover, usually with a red circle drawn around her midsection, or her eyes, analyzing her decay. The readers, the housewives, the office workers, the students devoured this content. It was tea and rice, Cha Yu Fan Hao conversation. There was a collective sadism in seeing the Jade Girl, the girl who was smarter and richer and cleaner than everyone else, being dragged through the mud. It made everyone feel better about their own compromised lives. See, even the perfect ones are dirty. Even the educated ones are just meat. But the silence was perhaps louder than the noise. In a healthy industry, when a star is subjected to such a vicious, coordinated campaign of character assassination, especially one based on a rumor of sexual violence, her peers would rally. Statements would be issued. Colleagues would refuse to speak to the offending magazines. For Gigi, there was only omerta. The silence of the Hong Kong entertainment industry in the early 2000s was deafening. The other stars, the heavenly kings, the divas, the directors, said nothing. Why? Because they were terrified. They were terrified of the tycoons who allegedly ordered the cake punishment. To speak up for Gigi was to criticize the emperor, and to criticize the emperor was career suicide. And they were terrified of the media. If they defended her, the puppy teams would turn their lenses on them. They would dig up their skeletons. So Gigi stood alone. Ekin Cheng, caught in his own storm of criticism for leaving Maggie Shu, could not protect her. His own image as the loyal hero was in tatters. He was fighting for his own survival. The industry watched Gigi drown and did nothing but check their own life jackets. This isolation is the true tragedy of the dark media era. It wasn't just that the magazines were mean. It was that they successfully severed the social bonds that hold a community together. They made empathy too expensive. By 2001, the Jade Girl brand was effectively dead. The magazines had done their job. They had taken a human being and turned her into a grotesque caricature. Gigi Leung was no longer a person. She was a walking scandal. The cake rumor had merged with the Fox Spirit label to create a monster that the public loved to hate. The psychological toll was immense. We are not talking about stress. We are talking about the complete erosion of self. How do you look in the mirror when the entire city believes you have been defiled? How do you sing a love song when the audience is laughing at a joke you can't hear? Gigi retreated. She stopped reading the papers. She stopped watching TV. She built a wall around herself, brick by brick. But the cameras were always there, waiting for the crack. The butcher shop of the Hong Kong media had carved her up, selling pieces of her dignity for 10 Hong Kong dollars a copy. And the city was still hungry. The years between 2000 and 2006 were not a hiatus for Gigi Leung. They were a sentence. In the lexicon of celebrity, we often talk about wilderness years, implying a period of professional irrelevance or absence. But for Gigi, this era was something far more suffocating. She did not disappear. She was not allowed to disappear. She was trapped in the center of the frame, illuminated by the harsh, relentless spotlight of a city that had decided she was the villain of the decade. She was working harder than ever, releasing albums, filming movies, cutting ribbons at shopping mall openings, but she was doing it all from inside a glass prison. She could see the audience and they could see her, but the air between them had frozen into a solid wall of judgment. This psychological exile was intensified by the specific claustrophobic geography of Hong Kong celebrity. It is a village masquerading as a metropolis. Everyone knows which tower you live in. Everyone knows which salon does your hair. Everyone knows the license plate of your car. There is no hinterland to retreat to. For Gigi, the sanctuary of her home in the mid-levels became a bunker. The windows, which once offered commanding views of Victoria Harbor, a symbol of conquering the city, were now permanently draped. To look out was to risk being seen by a long lens positioned on a neighboring roof. To step onto the balcony was to invite a headline about her gaunt figure or her lonely silhouette. The city that had once embraced her as its daughter now felt like a panopticon. The cake incident rumor was the background radiation of her life during these years. It wasn't spoken about to her face. Hong Kong society is too polite for that. But it was in the eyes of every person she met. When she walked into a boardroom to negotiate a contract, she could see the flicker of recognition in the eyes of the male executives. They weren't thinking about her box office numbers. They were replaying the tape of the urban legend in their heads. They were wondering if it was true. They were wondering what she had looked like in that hospital bed. This is the specific violence of sexual humiliation rumors. They strip a woman of her authority. How do you command respect as an artist, as a businesswoman, when the person across the table imagines you as a prop in a grotesque game of torture? And then there was the Fox Spirit label. If the cake was the physical stain, the fox was the moral brand. The relationship with Aiken Cheng, which had begun with the explosive siege of Saigon, had settled into a grim, sieged reality. They were the most famous couple in Hong Kong, but they were famous for the wrong reasons. They were the Bonnie and Clyde of betrayal. The public narrative had calcified. Maggie Hsu, the discarded ex-girlfriend, was the martyr. Aiken was the weak king led astray. And Gigi? She was the architect of the ruin. The fox spirit archetype in Chinese culture is not just a homewrecker. She is a creature of unnatural ambition who drains the vitality of men. The tabloids gleefully tracked Aiken's career decline, which was largely a fiction but a convenient one, and blamed it entirely on Gigi's bad feng shui. Every failing movie, every sluggish album sale for Aiken was laid at her feet. She is bad luck, the aunties in the wet markets would mutter. She has the eyes of a predator. This relentless victim blaming created a toxic feedback loop with the cake rumor. In the twisted moral calculus of the Hong Kong public, Gigi's suffering was justified. Did she get humiliated by a tycoon? Well, the logic went. That's what happens to bad women. That's the price of ambition. She hurt Maggie, so now she gets hurt. It was karmic retribution served on a platter of misogyny. The city felt no pity for her because they believed she had forfeited her right to pity the moment she walked out of Aiken's house that birthday morning. Living inside this hatred requires a dissociation of the self. Gigi Leung had to split into two people. There was the Gigi who appeared on stage, smiling, waving, singing coward, Dan Xiaogui, with a fragile, crystalline voice. And there was the woman who went home and stared at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever be clean again. Her work during this period reflects this fracture. If you listen to the albums released between 2001 and 2005, like Suddenly This Summer or Entertainment, there is a shift. The Jade Girl sweetness is still there because that was her commercial product, but there is a strain in the vocal cords. The lyrics, often penned by the industry's top writers, began to veer into themes of misunderstanding, resilience, and the pain of loving in the spotlight. She was trying to communicate her humanity to a public that only saw a caricature. But the audience wasn't listening. They were watching. The concerts were the hardest. Standing on the stage of the Hong Kong Coliseum is usually the pinnacle of a star's career. For Gigi, it was a trial by fire. Thousands of faces in the dark. How many of them had read the next magazine article that morning, detailing her secret surgeries? How many of them were laughing? There were moments caught on bootleg recordings where her smile falters, where the mask slips for a fraction of a second, revealing a profound, exhausted terror. She was performing for her executioners. And what of the relationship that started it all? The romance with Aiken Cheng, forged in the fires of scandal, could not survive the suffocation. A relationship requires oxygen. It requires a private space where two people can just be people. But Gigi and Aiken had no private space. Their love was a political statement. They had to be happy. They had to be perfect to prove that the scandal was worth it. If they broke up, the haters would win. If they fought, the tabloids would gloat. The pressure turned their home into a pressure cooker. Every argument was loaded with the weight of the ruined reputations. Ekin, dealing with his own career stagnation and the guilt of the traitor label, reportedly withdrew into video games and his close circle of male friends. Gigi, desperate to reclaim her standing, became more driven, more anxious. They were two people drowning, clinging to each other, but only pulling each other down faster. The 7-year itch is a cliche, but in January 2006 it became a headline. The announcement was brief, sterile, and devastating. Gigi Leung and Ekin Cheng had separated. The schadenfreude, joy in others' misfortune in Hong Kong, was explosive. The tabloids ran commemorative issues celebrating the end of the fox. Maggie wins, shouted the covers 7 years after the fact. The public gloated. See? We told you. It never lasts when you steal it. For Gigi, this was rock bottom. She was 30 years old. She had lost the Jade Girl title. She had lost the Love of the Century. She carried the scar of the cake incident. She had spent her 20s fighting a war against the entire city, and she had lost. The silence in her apartment in 2006 must have been deafening. The phone stopped ringing with the same frequency. The fair-weather friends, the producers, the socialites who used to beg for invites vanished. In Hong Kong, you are only as valuable as your last hit or your current boyfriend. Gigi had neither. She was expired goods. It was in this absolute void that the realization began to form. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, creeping dawn. She looked at the city she had been born in, the city she had conquered, and the city that had chewed her up. She realized that she could never win here. The script was written in permanent ink. To the people of Hong Kong, she would always be the Sue Sam and the girl with the cake. She could cure cancer, she could win an Oscar, and they would still whisper about the tycoon and the dessert. The realization was terrifying, but it was also liberating. If she couldn't be Gigi Leung, the Jade Girl, anymore, then who was she? She began to look at the map. Not the map of Kowloon and Hong Kong Island, but the map of the world. She started to travel alone, not the sponsored trips with an entourage of assistants and stylists, but actual travel. She went to London, she went to Paris, she walked down streets where nobody knew who Ekin Cheng was. She sat in cafes where nobody cared about the Emperor Group. In a coffee shop in Paris, a waiter might have smiled at her. Not because she was a star, not because he wanted to sleep with a fox spirit, and not because he was mocking her. He smiled because she was a tall, striking woman with short hair ordering a cappuccino. That anonymity was a drug more potent than fame. It was the first breath of fresh air she had taken in a decade. The psychological exile was transforming. She was no longer hiding in her apartment. She was preparing to defect. She realized that her survival depended on a radical act. She had to divorce Hong Kong. She had to find a place where her body belonged to her again. Not to the tabloids, not to the tycoons, and not to the ghosts of 1999. The glass prison had shattered, not from the outside, but because she had finally stopped pressing her face against the glass, begging for approval. She turned her back on the audience, and for the first time she started walking towards the exit door, towards a plane ticket, and towards a future that had no script. By 2011, Hong Kong had become a cage. It was a gilded cage, certainly. Gigi Leung was still a household name. She still commanded high fees for appearances, and she lived in luxury. But it was a cage nonetheless. The bars were made of headlines. Every time she stepped out for a coffee, the narrative followed her. Is she lonely? Is she aging? Is she still paying for the sins of 1999? The Fox Spirit label had faded slightly into a dull, throbbing scar, but the cake incident rumor was immortal. It was the static noise in the background of her life, a frequency that only she could hear, constantly reminding her that to the people of this city, she was permanently soiled. She had tried to play the game. After the cataclysmic breakup with Ekin Cheng in 2006, she had attempted to date within the accepted circles. There were rumors of a French boyfriend, Sly, and an American diplomat, Matthew. But the Hong Kong media devoured these relationships before they could even breathe. They treated her love life like a reality show where the audience was rooting for her to fail. See? No one wants the damaged goods, the foreigners are just passing through. The Shengnu leftover woman stigma began to attach itself to her. In Chinese society, a woman over 30 without a husband is a problem to be solved. A woman over 35 is a tragedy. Gigi was approaching that precipice. She was beautiful, wealthy, and talented, but in the brutal calculus of the Hong Kong marriage market, she was high risk. No local man of status wanted to inherit the baggage of the tycoon and the fox. The shadow of the Emperor Group and the ghost of Ekin Cheng were too big to fit in a normal apartment. She needed to vanish. The decision to travel to Spain in February 2011 wasn't a strategic career move. It was a gasp for air. It was a solo trip, a concept that terrified her handlers. A star of her magnitude wandering alone in Europe? What if she was recognized? What if she was unsafe? But Gigi knew the real danger wasn't in Barcelona. It was in Causeway Bay. When she landed in Spain, something shifted in the atmosphere. The air didn't smell of humidity and exhaust. It smelled of salt and cured ham and indifference. Nobody looked at her. Nobody cared. To the people of Catalonia, she was just a tall, striking Asian tourist with a pixie cut. They didn't know about the Jade Girl. They didn't know about the cake. They didn't know about the siege of tycoon. For the first time in 15 years, she was invisible. And in that invisibility, she found herself. It was in this state of glorious anonymity that she met Sergio. The story of their meeting is almost cinematic in its banality, which is exactly what makes it profound. Far from a VIP gala or a private yacht, it was a chance encounter. Sergio Crespo Gutes was not a tycoon. He was not a movie star. He was a food executive, a man who worked with tangible things like yogurt and biscuits, not intangible things like face and rumors. He saw a woman sitting alone. He approached her. In that first conversation, a miracle occurred. He asked no questions about Ekin Cheng. He stole no glances at her stomach searching for surgical scars. Nor did he ask for a selfie to sell to Apple Daily. He simply asked for her name. He asked her what she was doing in Spain. He asked her if she liked the food. He was a civilian. To Gigi, Sergio represented the clean slate. In the hermetically sealed world of Hong Kong entertainment, everyone is connected by 6 degrees of scandal. Everyone knows everyone's dirty laundry. But Sergio was from a different universe. He existed outside the blast radius of her past. This ignorance was her salvation. With Sergio, she didn't have to apologize for her history because, to him, it didn't exist. She could be the Gigi of 2011, funny, intelligent, curious, wounded, but healing, without the ghost of the Gigi of 1999 hovering over her shoulder. The romance moved with a velocity that stunned her friends. It was a blitzkrieg of emotion. They spent weeks talking, walking through the Gothic quarters of Barcelona, eating dinner at 10 p.m. like the locals. It was a rebellion against the Hong Kong clock, where every minute is monetized. But the fear was still there. Gigi knew that if the Hong Kong media found out about Sergio, they would destroy him. They would dig into his past. They would mock his job. They would compare his salary to hers. They would call him a soft rice king, a man living off a woman. So she protected him with a ferocity she had never shown before. For 6 months, the relationship was a state secret. She flew back and forth between Hong Kong and Spain, living a double life. In Hong Kong, she was the stoic single diva. In Spain, she was a woman in love, laughing loudly in tapas bars. The proposal came quickly. It had to. They both knew that this bubble of privacy couldn't last forever. The paparazzi have long lenses, and secrets in the iPhone age are fragile. Sergio proposed not with a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, the standard requirement for a Hong Kong diva, but with a promise of a life that was real. The wedding was set for October 3rd, 2011. The location, Ibiza, the White Isle. Known for its hedonistic club scene, but also for its stark, blindingly beautiful sunlight and azure waters. It was the antithesis of the dark, velvet-draped karaoke rooms where her nightmare had begun. It was open, it was bright, it was free. The guest list was small, barely 80 people. Only her closest friends, like Charlie Yeung and Valen Shu, and family were invited. There were no press passes, no live broadcast deals, no sponsor's logo on the backdrop. When the photos were finally released to the media, on her terms after the vows were spoken, Hong Kong gasped. There she was, Gigi Leung, the woman who had been dragged through the mud for a decade, standing on a cliff edge overlooking the Mediterranean. She was wearing a simple, elegant white lace gown. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. And next to her was a man nobody knew, a tall, handsome Spaniard with a kind face. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at her. The symbolism of marrying a foreigner was not lost on the Hong Kong public. In the eyes of the traditionalists, it was a defection. She gave up on Hong Kong men, they whispered. She had to go to the other side of the world to find someone who would take her. But to the women of Hong Kong, the ones who had watched her torture for 10 years, it looked like something else. It looked like an escape. By marrying Sergio, Gigi was declaring that she no longer played by Hong Kong rules. She was opting out of the system. She was saying, you can keep your tycoons, you can keep your rumors, you can keep your judgment. I am choosing a life where I am just a woman, not a target. The cake incident rumor relies on the premise that the woman is trapped, that she has to submit to the power structure to survive, that she has nowhere to go. Ibiza was the refutation of that premise. Gigi proved that she could go. She proved that the world was bigger than the Emperor Group. She proved that there were places where a birthday cake was just a cake and where a woman's value wasn't determined by which billionaire she had offended. The wedding was an exorcism. As she danced under the Spanish stars, surrounded by people who loved her, not for her fame, but for her soul, the ghost of the Jade Girl finally evaporated. She was no longer the Shusam. She was no longer the victim. She was Mrs. Crespo Goots. And for the first time in a decade, the fox was sleeping soundly, safe in the arms of a man who didn't even know she was supposed to be a villain. Back in Hong Kong, the magazines scrambled to spin the story. They tried to find dirt on Sergio. They tried to mock the wedding cost, 4 million Hong Kong dollars paid by them, not sponsors. But the venom didn't stick. The photos were too happy. The narrative was too clean. The escape was successful. Gigi Leung had tunneled out of the prison of public opinion and surfaced in paradise. But an escape is not the end of the story. You have to come back. You have to face the place you left, not as a prisoner, but as a free woman. The final act was less about running away and more about returning to claim her legacy. When the flight from Barcelona touched down at Chek-Lap-Kuk Airport in late 2011, the woman who walked through the arrival gates was not the same woman who had fled. The cameras were still there. The flashbulbs still popped like strobe lights in a nightclub, but the subject had changed. Gigi Leung was holding the hand of Sergio Crespo Gutes. The return is always the most dangerous part of the hero's journey. In Hong Kong showbiz, leaving is seen as a weakness. Coming back is seen as a plea for relevance. The tabloids were sharpening their knives, ready to dissect the foreigner husband narrative. They expected to find cracks. They expected to find a man who was overwhelmed, a soft rice king living off her fortune, or a cultural mismatch that would implode within months. Instead, they found a fortress. Sergio didn't hide. He didn't cringe at the cameras. He smiled with a kind of baffled amusement that disarmed the aggressive paparazzi. He wasn't playing the Hong Kong game of cool detachment. He was just a guy who loved his wife, and crucially, he wasn't part of the incestuous web of favors and debts that bound the local industry. He owed Albert Yeung nothing. He owed the Apple Daily nothing. This immunity was contagious. Slowly, the narrative around Gigi began to pivot. The Fox Spirit headline, which had haunted her for a decade, began to lose its adhesive power. It's hard to paint a woman as a predator when she is walking down Queens Road Central in sneakers, laughing with a husband who looks at her like she's the only person on earth. But the true turning point, the moment the cake incident was finally buried under the weight of a new reality, came in 2015, the birth of Sophia. In the shallow anthropology of Hong Kong celebrity, there is one currency more valuable than a scandal: a mixed-blood Eurasian baby. It is a cynical truth, but a truth nonetheless. The city, with its colonial hangover and obsession with international aesthetics, worships the image of the beautiful doll-like Eurasian child. When Gigi introduced Sophia to the world, the media frenzy was instantaneous, but it was benevolent. The magazines that had once printed headlines about her secret surgeries and ruined body were now clamoring for photos of the cutest baby in showbiz. Motherhood didn't just soften Gigi's image, it sterilized it. In the patriarchal view of the Hong Kong public, a mother is sacrosanct. You can mock a girlfriend, you can vilify a wife, but you cannot torture a mother. The cake incident, a story fundamentally about the sexual degradation of a single woman, lost its narrative logic. It didn't fit anymore. You couldn't look at Gigi holding Sophia and mentally superimpose the image of the tycoon's party. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Gigi used this shift with strategic brilliance. She didn't just become a mom, she became a matriarch of a new lifestyle. She launched a children's clothing line, Nanya, bringing Spanish aesthetics to Hong Kong. She moved away from the tragic ballad genre and started projecting an image of wellness, balance, and continental sophistication. But the most powerful act of reclamation was yet to come. It wasn't a movie role. It wasn't a hit song. It was a billboard. Around 2017, Gigi became the face of a massive public health campaign for the HPV vaccine, Gardasil. The sheer iron-willed audacity of this choice cannot be overstated. For nearly 20 years, Gigi Leung had been the subject of the most horrific urban legend in Asian entertainment history, a legend specifically about the invasion, infection, and trauma of her reproductive organs. The cake story was, at its core, a story about her body being dirty, damaged, and medically compromised by men. By becoming the ambassador for cervical cancer prevention, she was looking that rumor directly in the eye and destroying it. The campaign plastered her face across every MTR station, every bus body, and every clinic wall in the territory. In the posters, she looked radiant, strong, and authoritative. She was telling women, protect your bodies, take control of your health, don't let anything, virus or man, destroy you. It was a masterstroke of rebranding. It subconsciously overwrote the cake narrative. The public stopped associating her body with trauma and started associating it with health. She wasn't the victim on the operating table anymore. She was the guardian standing at the hospital door, barring entry to the sickness. Whether this was a calculated PR move or a subconscious desire to heal, it worked. It was the ultimate reclamation of bodily autonomy. By the time 2023 arrived, the landscape of Hong Kong had changed again. The city had been through the trauma of the 2019 protests and the silence of the pandemic. The old gossip of the 2000s felt like ancient history, artifacts from a different civilization. In February 2023, Gigi Leung stepped onto the stage of the Hong Kong Coliseum for her Here and Now concert. The Coliseum is the cathedral of cantopop. It is a cavernous, unforgiving space where careers are consecrated or buried. Gigi had stood there before, in her darkest years, singing to a crowd that she feared was laughing at her. But this night was different. She was 46 years old. Her signature short hair was still there, but the face beneath it had lines of experience that the Jade Girl never possessed. The audience was packed, but they weren't there for the scandal. They were there for the nostalgia. They were there because, like her, they had survived the bruising decades of Hong Kong's transformation. When she sang Short Hair, the entire arena sang with her. It wasn't a song about a haircut anymore. It was an anthem about cutting away the dead weight of the past. It was about survival. During the concert, there was a moment where she broke down. Not the staged, pretty tears of a starlet, but the ugly, gasping sobs of a woman who has carried a heavy load for too long. She spoke about Sergio. She spoke about Sophia. She didn't mention the cake. She never has and she never will. But the ghost of it was in the room. And for the first time, the audience didn't jeer. They cheered. A deafening, rolling roar of support that washed over the stage. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. We know what we did to you. We know what we said. And we are glad you are still here. So what is the legacy of the cake incident? It remains one of the darkest chapters in Hong Kong's pop culture history. It is a story that refuses to completely die because it serves a function. It is a grim fable about the price of fame in a capitalist patriarchy. It is the Little Red Riding Hood for the modern age, warning young girls that if they stray into the forest of the tycoons, the wolves will not just eat them, they will play with them first. Whether the incident actually occurred is almost irrelevant. If it was a fabrication, it was a lie of such focused, demonic cruelty that it reveals the absolute rot at the heart of the media culture that invented it. If it did happen, then Gigi Leung is not just a singer. She is a survivor of a crime that would have shattered a lesser person. The Jade Girl was a porcelain doll made to be looked at. The woman who exists today is made of something much harder. She is kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks are there. The history of the break is visible, but the piece is more beautiful and infinitely more valuable because it has been broken. Gigi Leung lives in a large house overlooking the ocean now. She has a husband who loves her, a daughter who adores her, and a career that she controls. The tycoons are old or dead. The magazines that tortured her have largely gone bankrupt in the digital age. The cake is just a story that old men tell in dark bars to feel important. But Gigi is still standing in the light, and that, in the end, is the only revenge that matters.